The allies of humanity knew something was wrong. They knew something was just not right. The humans, though quirky in their way of doing things, don't just get up and leave without a single word. They don't just turn their ships and fly away for no reason. They just left. So many of them. Over 70% just left, got in their ships and left. They left the system they had fought so hard to take. Why were they leaving? What was going on? Humans themselves had no idea what awaited them. If they did, they might have moved even faster. The humans jumped into the industrial sector. This sector had a standard yellow star, 5 habitable planetoids, which included 3 planets and 2 moons, 4 shipyards, of course, with their own defenses, along with its own home defense fleet. Home defense fleets are usually not very large, just there enough that they'll ward off anyone from raiding the place. There was mines, defense satellites, everything that should be, although because of all this, one would think from the outside it was a hardened target. No, this was actually a soft target, a simple industrial area, and that's all. Mostly made for designing and building civilian vessels, that's it. But as they jumped in, they received a horrific sight. Scanning all the area, they could see that both of the moons, with all their dome cities, had not only been glassed, but had been slagged down into their lower levels. Everyone was horrified at this. 2 of the 3 planets had been partially slagged, and there were fires still burning on their surfaces, still noticeable from space. Everyone was suddenly afraid. Everyone was fearing what was going to happen, what did happen, what was going on here. How come they received just the slightest bit of distress call and then nothing? They didn't know what was going on, but as they moved in, they had to be careful because there was debris everywhere. It constantly clanged off the hulls of the ships as they moved closer. They had to try and desperately get in to try and get any relief efforts. As they did, they could see that 2 of the 4 shipyards were completely mangled and destroyed. The others were severely damaged. The 2 that were destroyed were just hulks in the air, twisted and broken. All compartments ripped apart. The 2 that managed to be salvageable were damaged, but it was clear that they had put up one hell of a fight, as several of the enemy ships were now stuck inside the hull, as though they were coming in for almost a strafing run. Who the hell does that in space? And then lost control and slammed into the side. The defense fleet that was supposed to be there was barely functional. Most of them, if they were even intact, were adrift. Others could be seen putting on hasty repairs, and others were trying to get their crews outside to try and patch up the engines enough so they could at least keep life support going. There was no battleships or cruisers still functioning. The one battleship that was there was twisted and almost snapped in half completely. The cruisers were going under emergency repair as everybody could see flashes coming from them as the engineers on the outside tried to weld everything back together, trying desperately to get everything functional so they didn't die slowly in space. One of the million ways to die in space. And yes, they all still suck. Looking through, the mines had all been detonated, but it seems as though had limited effect. The defense satellites network was completely in tatters. It was currently repositioning the few satellites it had to spread across the planet. It seemed as though 2/3 of them were just gone, and 50% of those that were left were completely devoid of ammunition. The other ones barely had any left. The arriving forces immediately started sending out whatever they could to rescue, and everyone just went to work. Rescue and recovery ops were on, and there was no time to stop. The medical and civilian fleets began to arrive soon after, and they too immediately got to work. It would take several standard days to try and get all the bodies they could, bring them into the medical ships, trying desperately to save them. Some of the medical technology that humans use can definitely bring back a body that's been spaced, but not one that's been almost atomized. They do what they can, though. The equipment itself was looked over to see if it was salvageable, but that was a secondary notion. It's personnel, then equipment. But there wasn't much left on either side. The losses of the defense fleet was 93% of their equipment was just gone, insalvageable. It would all have to be melted down and reused. 57% of the personnel were unretrievable. The losses on the two moons were complete. 100% loss. It seemed as though whatever the enemy did, they had brought down the hammer of God, firing so many times that even the bunkers that were dug several kilometers deep were struck. One of the moons itself had a massive crack down the side, as it seemed like the force that they used of whatever weapon it was simply more than the planetoid could handle. Nobody could ever settle there again. The moon would have to do what it does in space to try and heal. If not, there's going to end up being two smaller moons, which would eventually crash in each other over time and then plummet down to the planet below if they don't get caught in the gravity well as is. The idea of this was horrifying. Losses on the planet, personnel and equipment, was 21%. They tried their best to extinguish all the fires, but some of them were just so massive that they just had to let them go. Massive pine groves were burning for several thousand hectares wide and growing, putting up huge covers of smoke. It made it difficult at best to land any type of retrieval units. However, when you trust your sensors, it's doable. One of the only issues was having to get by the debris field left by the defense satellites, as the satellites were at total 73% loss. It was incredible, the amount that was lost. The shipyards were looking at 64% loss. The two that had made it by seemed as though they had been struck, but it seemed like the first two that were completely destroyed were the priority targets. Whichever way it went, it didn't matter. It was absolutely horrifying to see that human space had been struck, and everybody was asking the same question: how the hell did they get through? Looking at the enemy forces that were there, it didn't take long before the black boxes, the logbooks, and everything else was looked into to see how many of the enemy forces were able to survive. The answer? None. Enemy forces lost everything, 100%. It seems this was an all or nothing gambit as they came into the system. Images and video of the attack began to surface, and they were sent to humanity as a whole so everyone would know what happened. The full recording was sent out to every system, planet, colony, and ship in humanity, and nobody could possibly believe what they saw. An absolutely massive enemy fleet composed of several battleships and an amalgamation of others came through, and they actually warped in mid-system. This is something they've never done before. What the hell were they thinking? Even the humans know that was a bad idea. You're going to just warp into some sort of shit show if you do that. Everyone knows you're going to end up being caught in some sort of ambush if you even think for a second that you can jump anywhere but outside the system and then move your way in. Everyone would think as soon as this fleet came in, they would demand that some sort of surrender, some sort of compensation, anything would happen. No, they just started shooting. Everything, every single weapon they had immediately targeted and fired. They filled the space with energy weapons, ballistic weapons, and torpedoes just rained down. The human fleet moved to engage as fast as possible. They were separated and spread all over the system, not given time to organize themselves to blockade from the planet. They tried desperately to get in some sort of defensive formation before the enemy came down on them like some sort of sledgehammer. The only thing that gave them time was the minefields. The enemy seemed to come in from just about every single direction, and they did strike the minefield. However, the enemy fleet had learned from their mistakes. The enemy had spread out enough so that they could make sure that the mines did not make a huge difference in their numbers. Though effective, it was only good enough to grab the largest of their ships and pull them in close. Unfortunately, the enemy realized what was going on and targeted the mines. This caused premature detonations, which only caused some of the ships to be destroyed. Battleships on both sides began to fire. They tried desperately to keep the enemy back. The enemy was very inaccurate in their fire, but there was just so many more of them. Human battleships, the one that was there, fired accurate shots, taking out several of the battleships, firing 3 shots and almost completely cooking their gun before they had to fire. Even in the video, you could see that the gun itself was glowing hot and barely able to keep functioning. It was a good thing they shut it down. A third shot would have made that ship explode. As the fleets would get close to lunar orbit, they began to target the moons. They began to fire down indiscriminately at the domed cities. Some of the shuttles desperately tried to take off, but the enemy didn't seem to care. They simply fired on them. And what hurt most people is the fact that there was one medical ship. It was clear that it was unarmed except for 2-point defense cannons, which are usually used to knock space debris away. But the giant symbol on the side made everybody know exactly what they were carrying. They were carrying the sick and wounded. But this ship was not given any quarter and was blasted to pieces and ended up spiraling its way towards the planet, getting caught up in the gravity well, and everyone would watch in horror as it went into the atmosphere and burned up on the way in. It didn't even reach the ground before exploding. The human moon-based colonies were then targeted directly by their main guns on the destroyers and cruisers, and they started laying waste to the colonies. They wiped out everything and then began to fire even more. It seems as though their sensors could figure out that there was more underneath, deep inside the planet, and they kept going until the moon itself cracked. At that point, they realized that if they shattered the moon, then their own fleet would be caught up in it. The defense fleet would fire wildly towards these ships targeting the moons, but it was just too far away for accurate shots. Even the energy weapons couldn't get a decent shot as these ships realized that if they just kept randomly changing position every 2 or 3 seconds, they would be out of the way of whatever shot was taking place. The random movements made it difficult at that range. The moon defenses were simply torn asunder as they were bombarded down, and even the bunkers underneath were ripped to pieces. They watched as one of the bunkers was ripped open, and the explosion forced everybody up and into space, as the light gravity of the moon was not enough to keep the bodies down. You could see some of them flailing around as they were spaced slowly. Being ruthlessly efficient, they even went around the other side of the planet, and as shuttles tried desperately to launch out of their docks, they were shot down and tore apart piecemeal as they tried to get away, and the shipyards were next. From the composition of their forces, they could tell that the shipyards were considered a light target, as they were only sent small corvette and frigate classes to take them down. But they found out very quickly that shipyards are not defenseless. Most of them had retractable turrets and launchers, and those were raised up and began to fire. The first wave of enemy was torn apart quickly by all these retractable turrets and missile batteries. The second wave was torn apart again as the batteries and turrets continued to fire, but as the third wave came through, the ordnance ran out. They were out of missiles and torpedoes, and the ballistic cannons were running out of ammunition. The energy weapons were still able to function, but they're limited in number, and they were not able to save the other 2 shipyards. It was horrific, as those were not military targets. Those were civilian shipyards. Seemingly not want to lose any more ships, they aimed towards the planetary defense satellites and the planets themselves. It was another shoot 'em out, as the defense fleet was now relegated to just a few small ships, trying what they could to take out as many of the ships on the far side as possible, moving in ways that those ships are not meant to, and damaging much of the crew in the process. The defense satellites were far more effective than any station, yet they were still static targets. They were able to put out an impressive amount of fire, however, again, static targets. Once targeted, there wasn't much they could do. A few decoys, some chaff, some sort of electronic countermeasures, but that's about all they've got. They're meant to slow them down, not stop them. And the enemy fought through and got to the planet. As the enemy pushed onto the planet, they tried to make landfall with everything they had left. At least, they tried. The remainder of the fleet that could still fight flanked the enemy so that there was no escape, not knowing that the enemy was in an all or nothing gambit in this battle. Orbital bombardment hit the cities as they started to come down towards the ground. The transports immediately deployed themselves, but they did not use drop troopers, no. They still went with corvettes and frigates. Anything larger would get caught up in the gravity well, and they were torn apart. Only 12% of the landing forces landed successfully, but none could take off. The large fires were mainly from the crashed ships and not from the bombardment, as the bombardment was aimed at the cities, and the crashed ships, well, their pilots didn't want to die, so they simply pulled out of the dive and skidded across the ground, usually lighting their own ships on fire as they began to rip themselves to pieces and rip those inside to pieces as well, leaving not only trails of their own fuel, their own lubricants, but also the blood of their own smeared in large swaths on the ground, and the smell of that cooking off as everything caught fire was enough to make the most ardent person barf. The founding city on this sector, like all of them are, used to be a dome city. The dome still remains, but more to show which one they are. But one of the ships of the enemy decided to say screw it and kamikazed right into the dome and crashed, exploding in the center of the city, causing mass havoc as many of the buildings began to topple like dominoes as they were crashed into by this massive ship skidding across the ground. The enemy that deployed believed that they would be facing only a few military personnel, and they were right. There were only a few military personnel, but they were also facing an entire civilian population that has absolutely no more fucks to give. The civilians began to fight like cornered beasts as hand to hand combat became common. They would run up grabbing anything, swinging it, and just crushing any type of bone or carapace or piercing through any type of hide they could. Some of them jumping up, screaming, slashing with their own type of claws, biting in and ripping off large chunks of their opposing forces. It was a bloodbath on either side, and it was a complete melee from hell. The enemy found out too late. When humans run out of ships, they use guns, and when they run out of guns, they will pick up anything, whether it's a knife or a stick, and if they can't find that, they're just going to use their bare hands to rip you apart. And that is what they did. Looking at where the enemy dropped, it was clear their targets were military bases, along with assembly and manufacturing plants, as they wanted to stop the means of production and they wanted to stop personnel from actually going up and beating them into the ground in space, if that can actually happen in space. It seemed as though certain population centers were also targeted as secondary targets, not their primary. These would include hospitals, schools, even churches, anywhere where they thought there would be a mass amount of humans. They were targeted usually from the skies by the frigates on the way down, and once they were on the ground, they went in with their foot soldiers and decided that they were going to take down these centers. Entire hospitals were nothing but smoldering wrecks, and it was horrific. Some of them were sent in with all sorts of high explosive and launched them right into the doors, blowing the doors open, and then used a secondary charge to launch in and watch the entire building explode. Those who came down to the surface to help found many civilians just in heaps, many of them barely alive, and just too many didn't survive. The fleets responded late, unfortunately. Battle groups after battle groups arrived with aid and tried to recover everybody and everything. Medical ships and other personnel from all over human space showed up. Civilian ships of all shapes and sizes began to jump into the system. From the smallest cargo shuttle to the largest personal yacht showed up and immediately began to transmit, asking where their supplies were most needed. They would send a list of what they had and what they could do, and they were immediately sent, coordinated down to every area to recover who they could. Those in the recovery fleets were put in charge of making sure everybody was where they were supposed to be. The massive amount of civilian engineers and just workers would show up trying desperately to help out wherever they possibly could. Even those who only had first aid knowledge came to help. The recordings and images of civilians coming to help, side by side with drop troopers, searching desperately with survivors, went all over human space and into Allied space as well. Video of military and civilians rushing bodies to the aid station used to show the resolve of humanity, show them that they can be shot at, beaten, blown up, but humanity won't stay down. Amongst all this, a simple interview was one of the most watched recordings ever. It was a wealthy man in the sector, the wealthiest actually, was interviewed because he owned one of the space docks. It was a brand new one, too. It was going to be used to create some of the best ships out there, and you would think a man like that would be all smiles standing in a suit, but no. This man looked ragged, looking like he hadn't shaved or showered in almost a week, maybe more. He stood there, getting asked questions from the interviewer about what they were seeing. He was standing in front of what everybody knew as regeneration tubes. These were used in extreme dire circumstances, so dire that back in the day you would just write someone off as dead. And each tube had someone in it. Each tube had a member of his family. He said they were in the shipyard during the attack. They didn't make it to the bunker before the space dock was actually struck. They tried desperately to get everyone in, but it didn't matter. The enemy came in and seemingly tried to blow every single compartment. There was a sudden rush of decompressurization, and there went his family. Unfortunately, he was on the other side of the space dock and wasn't there to help them out. The man explains how they're lucky. Physically, they'll come out fine. The regeneration tubes were basically miracles of technology. Mentally, though, with this, he dropped his head. He stated, "My kids were just too young to be space. Far too young to be spaced." He motioned over to his wife and said how she'll be able to deal with it much better, having some life experience. But the kids will have nightmares for decades due to this. Decades because they will have experienced the memory of being shoved out into space as the wall was ripped open, how an explosion tore the inside of the space dock apart, and suddenly they're in a vacuum. No gravity, no air, no nothing. Just waiting there as you feel your lungs start to implode. The man turns to show a regen patch on his chest. It seemed as though he had just patched himself up and left most of his medical tech to those who knew how to use it and those who needed it a lot more than him. He stated how he was a military man and he's used to getting hurt. This resonated beyond all measure. especially as he beat his hands against the tubes and said, "My family was innocent, and this is the only thing I can do for them." He turns his attention to the shipyard. He waves his hand and says, "This is what else I can do for us, for humanity itself." They look out, and every single civilian vessel that wants to be refit gets it for free. The camera zooms in and notices that ships are getting weapons and armor attached. These are not any type of military vessel. No, these are civilian cargo halters, transports. They're some sort of specialty yacht. These were just civilian ships, and now they are being prepped for war. Several ships are even being set up as torpedo carriers, as they're seemingly being strapped onto the side with some sort of feeding system put on the inside. Others are just being covered in point defense cannons. A few are even being cracked open, and turret level cannons are being installed inside the keel of the ship. The man simply stated, "This will never happen again." As this was going on, the militaries came together to try and figure out how the enemy got through. As it turned out, the enemy had used a new type of warp system. It's a lot faster and a lot harder to detect, but not impossible. Now that they figured out how to detect them, they just simply had to set up their own detection buoys way out on each sector. Because of this, they'd be able to detect when these warp signatures were coming through. Though they were a lot faster, it still meant they would have several hours depending on how far they wanted to move. This would give humanity enough time to prep their defenses, but this was not going to happen again. Being blindsided, being sucker punched, being kicked in the nuts while your back is turned doesn't happen twice. One of the battleship captains that had grown up in this sector went home to actually see that his entire home, his actual house, all his neighborhood was gone. Just gone. The enemy had dropped a ship on it, and for several dozen blocks in every direction was just gone, just smoldering heaps. With this, he looked around to see what humanity was doing and sent one message out to the factions. Though when the factions received it, they couldn't understand what it meant. The translation didn't make sense at all. They read, "You previous surface 3%, you exhausted, made it open forthwith." The faction leadership thought this was some sort of joke. They knew that they had struck deep into human territory. They knew that they had instilled fear. So whatever this transmission actually meant, probably was a mention of how scared they were, that they knew that they were going to fall to the might of the factions that remained. With this, they began to assemble the next round of fleets and thought, "It should be much easier to take the humans now."